Welcome to Housing for Huntsvillians, the podcast, a podcast about one couple's quest to eliminate homelessness in Huntsville by August 2026.
What up?
What's up, guys?
Welcome to Housing for Huntsvillians. Today, we're going to talk about the color of law.
Sounds fantastic.
So we had on Remus Bowden in episode 15 to talk about housing racism. And in prep for that interview, I began to read Color of Law for the first time.
Sounded like an interesting book.
It was really, really good. And I knew it was going to be good because everybody was like, it's good. And I'm super interested in the topic. It's definitely one of those where I was like, I'd read The Case for Reparations by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and I'd read, articles that talked about the history of the Federal Housing Federal Housing Administration and redlining and the National Realtors and all that. And so I felt like, okay, I get it, but it definitely did not feel like review. Despite having a broad understanding of housing racism, or thinking I did, I definitely learned a lot reading this book.
Well, that's awesome. So it wasn't just covering stuff you'd already known in passing. It actually presented a lot of value and new information.
Absolutely.
Nice.
So this is not going to be a Cliff's Notes. This episode is not a replacement for reading the book. I could not do that. One, I listened to it and my notes were not that good, and there's just so much good in there. So keep that in mind. But I did want to kind of just share some thoughts that I had while reading it and after reading it. So I finished it right before Thanksgiving. So I've had a little bit of time to reflect, and I wrote some notes. And I wanted to share kind of two thoughts. And the first has to do with lies of omission. So one of the things that I was thinking about was how ignorant I was about housing racism, particularly the severity and extent of the violence of housing racism. So, the racially motivated murder, assault, arson, and other forms of violence to do with housing particularly.
Jeez.
So I knew that there was violence associated with keeping Black families out of white neighborhoods. I thought that violence only extended to cross burnings. That is not the case. So in one instance alone, white supremacists burned a Black family to death in their home in retaliation for moving into a white neighborhood.
Jeez.
And this is just, there were so many Black families that white supremacists lynched for trying to move into white neighborhoods. And in at least one case, it was a white police officer who committed the crime. And in many, many instances, white police officers aided and abetted the criminals. So knowing that I had no idea, and these are documented cases. It's not like we as a society are just finding out about this, or historians didn't know. It's just not taught in public schools. It's not discussed in the media. At least not to the point where I was familiar with them. And Rothstein, the author of the book, actually goes into textbooks and reads what they wrote about this, and it's just completely whitewashed.
Jeez.
So if I don't understand the frequency and severity of historical racial violence, why would I assume I understand the frequency and severity of current instances of violence aimed at reinforcing residential racial segregation?
Kind of puts things into perspective.
I think it reveals that I don't have a correct perspective, that I can't. So, that's sobering. Then the other thing that I thought about was okay, what's actually changed between then and now?
Hopefully something.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be cynical, but I also don't want to be naive. And I think when it comes to injustice, naivete is worse than cynicism. And I think that behavior changes when beliefs and incentives change. But like, where have beliefs and incentives really changed? I mean, white people still believe that non-white neighbors lower their property values. NPR reported on a 2021 study by Freddie Mac, which showed that appraisers are twice as likely to give whites as to give, twice as likely to give Black and Latino homeowners low appraisals as they are to give white homeowners low appraisals for their properties.
Jeez.
I mean, just look at like, all right, so the Federal Housing Authority, Federal Housing Administration basically became HUD as far as I can tell. Federal Housing Administration perpetuated explicit racism in their policies. That's something that Rothstein brings the receipts to show. Well, how is HUD doing anything any different with running public housing and giving people vouchers as opposed to cash assistance, right? We know that the majority of the recipients are, well, I don't know about the majority, but we know the recipients are disproportionately Black. And we know that the only reason to give someone public housing or a housing voucher as opposed to cash assistance is an assumption that they're not going to spend the cash assistance appropriately. We know that we now have a lot of evidence. We have a lot of studies showing that families do spend the cash assistance appropriately. So, I mean, unless there's like graft involved, which I'm sure there is to some extent, why give families vouchers and public housing instead of cash assistance, except racism?
Yeah, and I forget exactly which episode, but if you want to hear more about why like the voucher system is bad, you've definitely covered that in past episodes.
Yeah, I mean, I've covered more why public housing, subsidized housing is not a good idea. But
you've hit on it though.
Yeah. I mean, it's not really that difficult to figure out why vouchers are not a good idea. Landlords don't want to take them.
Yeah.
A, we don't have enough of them, and B, even the people who get a voucher often can't get housing. So now I want to talk about housing racism in Huntsville, Alabama, where in the year of our Lord 2023, a bunch of old white homeowners showed up to a planning commission meeting to complain about new apartments near their houses. Ken Dunn said, and I quote, "These will be high-end apartments, I'm sure, but it's not single-family residences. Apartment complexes tend to decrease the value of our single-family homes." Is it the apartment complexes or the people who live there? Ken?
Yeah.
Riddle me that. James Yates, quote, "I grieve for my name." I grieve. You have to laugh. You have to laugh or burn it all to the ground. "I grieve for my neighbors on Garth Road. They will have to look at this every single day," this being apartment buildings. Oh, gee. I grieve for them too.
Wow.
James. What a hardship.
Must be nice if that's your only problem in life.
Can you imagine? Can you? Ah, my gosh, I'm so jealous.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, and as far as like police aiding and abetting racial violence, I mean, they aided and abetted violent crimes by the Proud Boys, an openly queerphobic, misogynistic, white supremacist group. Like, still doing it, so nothing's changed there.
The more you read, the more just depressing everything gets. But and it's good to know. Obviously.
Yeah. For more housing racism, I highly encourage you to read a tweet from lambda_calculus. It begins, "Some gems from the Chevy Chase Library and Community Center survey." One of the comments was just crime. "Housing, a good idea, but can the intended population afford the taxes?" read the whole thread. It is revealing if you don't know anything about housing racism.
Wow.
The other thing that I want to talk about, I guess the third thing is, and I've said this before, and I'm going to say it again until I stop running into people who don't understand it. So sorry for being tiresome, but if you want me to shut up about this, tell a friend so I never hear this again. But, you know, I keep hearing people talk about we need to get more people into home ownership. We need to give people a chance to build wealth for their family. Housing cannot be a wealth generation vehicle and broadly affordable at the same time. That is not possible. You know, people talk about, well, you got to buy a house so you can get your foot in the door to a better life.
Can't tell you how many times I've been told that.
So many times. Well, that foot in the door is necessarily stepping on someone else's neck. When you build wealth through housing value appreciation, you're stealing that wealth from the next person who has to buy a house, for the next person who has to rent, the next person who wants to live near you. So you're building wealth on the backs of your own grandchildren. There are ways to generate wealth that are positive sum, that don't directly take from people who want to live near you. So that's one. And then two, since we're talking about housing racism, the foot is disproportionately white and the neck is disproportionately black and brown in this country.
Yeah.
So the very concept of using housing for intergenerational wealth in a country that has systematically and continues to systematically lock black and brown people out of housing wealth is a system that necessarily perpetuates racial injustice.
Oh, yeah.
So anyway, read the book. It's great. Thanks for tuning in. Upzone Huntsville.
Hell yeah. We'll be back next week. But thank you for tuning in.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to Housing for Huntsvillians. This podcast is a project of Huntsville New Liberals. Sign up for our newsletter and RSVP to our monthly happy hour at huntsvillenewliberals.com.